I want to welcome everyone who is joining us today. This is the last in the 2024 series of artist talks before the summer season starts. And then we switch over to in-person artist talks. We are really happy to have Leah Aegerter be our artist, giving our artist talk tonight. She has a degree, a BFA in sculpture from Rhode Island School of Design. And prior to that, while she was in school, she was an artist, resident intern at the Carving Studio and Sculpture Center, and was an inspiration in the work that she was doing there, as well as part of a great team of resident interns. In 2022, she was named Aspen Art Museum Artist Fellow, which I'm sure is a prestigious award. She's also done residencies at Grand Canyon National Park, Rockland Woods, Haystack Mountain School of Craft. She has participated recently in last year in a two-person show and a solo show called Once a River at the Alpenglow Gallery at the Art Base in Basalt, Colorado. I am happy to, your artist statement is very poetic, and I would like you to just help fill it in with visuals.
Sounds good.
Great,
you. Thanks. All right, let's do this. And that. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight. And thanks so much, Carol, for the invitation to speak. As she mentioned, I was an intern when I was in college, and I'll talk a little bit about that. My name is Leah Aegerter. My pronouns are she, her. I am a sculptor, installation artist in Carbondale, Colorado, which is a small town on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains. The nearest town that you've probably heard of is Aspen, which is about 40 minutes away. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like our communities are actually very similar. Carbondale and West Rutland area, a lot of creative people, big emphasis on arts and culture within that tight-knit community, and kind of nestled in these two beautiful, though different, mountainous landscapes. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a background of who I am and the formative experiences that have gotten to me to what I'm making today. But then I'm really going to focus on sharing a body of work that I've been developing over the past few years. So I graduated or studied sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, and I graduated in 2017. So after my sophomore year of college, I came to the Carving Studio and Sculpture Center as an intern, which proved to be a very formative experience in my young artist career. I had never done stone carving before, so that was one big thing. And though I haven't necessarily continued it out of stone, I do a lot of carving of wood and other materials in my practice today. And it was just, I had never had that experience of working in an educational setting outside of college or other institutions. And teaching and being an art educator has become a really important part of my practice today. I also had never lived in the true Northeast. I mean, Rhode Island is kind of, but it was great to get to know a new landscape more in depth. But I think that educational component of being a workshop assistant and learning how to guide people and teach people really helped me along my path. So then after I graduated from college, I went to do another internship, this time at a center called Anderson Ranch, which is in Snowmass Village, Colorado. And it's very similar to the carving studio, but at a larger scale. So during our summer workshop season, they might have had like 10 to 12 workshops happening at any given time across a variety of mediums. And I started as an intern there in the digital fabrication department, and then ended up working there for 5 years as later as the studio coordinator of the digital fabrication lab. And so here are just a few glimpses of life in Colorado and at Anderson Ranch. Again, big emphasis on community, on education, on connecting with artists, and on being outside. And this landscape has fueled me quite a bit since I've lived here for the past 7 years. At Anderson Ranch, I had access to all of this amazing equipment. So wood shop, metal shop, digital fabrication lab at my disposal, and not as much time as I would have liked to actually use those facilities. But it was very important to me in building my community here. But the kind of the main landscape that I'm going to focus on for this talk, and that has inspired my work over the past few years, is the Grand Canyon. So in the fall of 2019, I embarked on a 10-day backpacking trip with 5 friends in Grand Canyon. And 3 of those friends had hiked the entire North Rim previously over the course of several months. So as they planned this trip, they were, trying to find places that they had never been before, or routes that they hadn't yet taken in Grand Canyon. And it proved to be a very arduous, fast-paced, almost all off-trail trek. So we started on the South Rim, hiked down to the river, crossed it, North Rim, back over 10 days. And if any of you have ever hiked in Grand Canyon, you know that the navigation is quite difficult just due to all of these cliff bands and trying to circumvent them. So I covered a lot of ground, but at a very fast pace, but kind of the benefit of that was getting to see so much. And I had never been in a place with such diversity of mostly of geology and such access to this history of geology, or this geological record, which goes back 1.5 billion years to the oldest layer in Grand Canyon that's visible. So it was very inspiring to me, and I kind of tuned into geology in a way that I had never before engaged with it. So shortly after that 10-day trip, I began a practice of 3D scanning geology, and you could 3D scan anything. I just choose rocks. And I use a process of 3D scanning called photogrammetry. So this describes taking a few hundred images of any given object and then putting them into a software to stitch them together into a 3D model, which could then be output on digital fabrication equipment such as a 3D printer or a CNC router. And on my hikes throughout Colorado and Utah and the Southwest, I just started kind of tuning into these textures that I thought were cool, or maybe related to some better experience, emotional experience that I'd had in any one place, and I'd want to capture a moment of geology from that place. And I was taking these 3D scan textures, carving them out of wood on the CNC router at Anderson Ranch, and then kind of using these blocks of texture as stock material with which to compose abstract sculptures. So in this case, I'm chopping them up into these strips, coopering them, so giving them a slight taper, and then assembling them into an arch form. And I do consider these very abstract and kind of experimental as I learned how to access the language that I was beginning to work with. And yet they also held an emotional attachment for me, even if that's not totally legible to the viewer. This piece is about getting lost after going off trail, climbing out of Coyote Gulch in Utah with my dad, and thinking about the cracks in the earth and the negative space of the landscape and of time and of darkness. So then, as I said, I had access to all of this amazing equipment at Anderson Ranch, yet I wasn't able to work at as fast of a pace as I would have liked to move my practice forward. So in the summer of 2022, I decided to transition out of that job and pursue my practice full time, which is what I've been working on ever since. And the last project that I worked on while at the ranch was this piece, Sun and Stone, Dark Angel, which was part of an exhibition of outdoor sculptures that the ranch put on. And I wanted to create a little more conceptual legibility in the work, and also kind of take it to another level with incorporating another material into the sculptural work. And then I had also been spending a lot of time in Utah, where this texture comes from, and thinking about infrastructure like dams and fences that kind of infiltrate the environment. And I considered how we as a society are totally cradled and held by these industrial materials of infrastructure like cement and steel. And I wanted to create a sculpture that incorporated that. Yet I feel like our emotional grounding is in, and cradling is in the environment. So I created this piece that kind of funnels the energy back into the natural texture. And these two scans are a mirror image of each other. And I was thinking about how maybe one is a stand-in for me and the other is a stand-in for the landscape. We're nodding towards each other, cradled by the steel, but still the focal points. And there's just a detail of that one. So I took the summer off, and then in the fall of 2022, I had the opportunity to go back to Grand Canyon to do an artist residency. And I packed up my truck with my 3D printer and a bunch of materials, and I drove out to Arizona, where I was stationed on the South Rim of Grand Canyon for 2 months. I was alone in this apartment, so it was a very solitary experience, but also very good. And I just got to make work and be in the canyon. I spent about 14 nights below the rim on backpacking trips, about half of that alone, half with friends and family who had come to hike with me. And I also got to do a backpacking trip with some of the geologists from the park, and they showed me a bunch of really amazing fossils and kind of secret spots that I could access. So I would say that this has been one of the most profound experiences in my career and in my life. It's very much shaped the way that I engage with landscape in general, with my artwork, and just with everything. So I had left the facilities of Anderson Ranch, and I knew that I was going to need to find another material or means of working that didn't require such heavy equipment. So I couldn't do woodworking while at this residency because my studio was just a room. And I decided on working with paper as a way to work with another natural material that didn't require much facility. And my project that I designed while in residence was to document the textures of Grand Canyon through 3D scanning, building up a library of scans that I could access for work during the residency and also future work. And then somehow translating that into an installation or a body of work. And that was kind of the piece that I didn't really know how to do. But I started with 3D printing. So I would take these scans and then I would 3D print the molds for these works. So here's the printer in action. Here is a representation or an example of how I would print in multiple pieces and then put things together so that I could create larger mold forms. Sorry, those videos had some sound, which I forgot about. And then from there, I would cast paper onto the 3D prints. And then once it dried, peel it off. So the paper that I was working with is called Abaca paper. And it's great for sculptural use because the fibers are really long, giving it great wet strength. So I could cast a sheet of pulp, compress out the water, and then peel it off of the screen, and it wouldn't rip apart. It, held together, and I could press it into the mold, let it dry, and then I'm left with this sheet of paper that holds or retains the form of the rock. And I have to say, it was a very humbling experience beginning this journey with a new material. I hadn't been a beginner at something in quite a while, and it gave me a really good perspective, especially as an educator, of the vulnerability that students exercise to go to a workshop and try something new and try and express themselves in this really scary new way. So over the course of my 2 months in residence, I pretty much only made 2 small sculptures that will ever see the light of day. But I started by working with all of these small textures. So it's just 3D printing as much as possible, and then casting about 8-inch square sections. And then I thought that maybe I could put them together, but it just always turned out too Frankenstein. And so I realized that I needed to kind of limit my options and return to a familiar form. So I went back to this idea of the circle. So these are the 2 sculptures that I made that I was excited about. And it took me a lot of time to get there. I was working 2 months every day in the studio, no distractions, and this is what I did. But I think it's important to share that because there's so much effort and experimentation and failure that goes into being an artist, and you wouldn't get to make the good work without the bad work. So these pieces are about 16 inches in diameter. And I wanted to go back to the idea of the circle because it was kind of the most recent form that I had engaged with, that I had been excited about. And I was taking the same scan and 3D printing it at multiple scales and rotating as kind of a nod to the translation of digital to physical, because transformations like rotations are really easy to do on the computer and maybe a little bit harder to capture in life. And so I was using just sewing to attach the paper together here. When I got back home, in 2023, at the start of the new year, I was commissioned by the city of Aspen to make a series of these paper rocks, I call them, as part of an exhibition at the city hall. So I made about eight of these sculptures and really used it as an opportunity to experiment with form, with what the paper could do, with how far I could stretch it or fold it, and different sewing techniques. So, for example, in the image to the left, I'm spraying it with salt water again and again to kind of build up a crystal structure on the paper. And on the right, I'm thinking about slot canyons, and it's sprayed with a liquid graphite to give it that speckled texture. But I definitely quickly outgrew this once I did a little bit of deeper exploration within it. And I yearned to translate this vast, huge landscape of Grand Canyon more successfully by means of building larger sculptures. So now I'm getting into kind of the next phase of the work. And between those smaller sculptures and this, I got to go back to Grand Canyon, this time to do a 3-week river trip. And it was an amazing experience, but very, very different than what I had been doing before. So I was, instead of being alone, I was with 15 other people. We were traveling the river. We floated 277 miles down the Colorado through Grand Canyon. And it wasn't quite as introspective as the first experience had been, yet it was still very significant and important to me. And just experiencing the river in this new way, getting to see much more than I had on my legs by walking was really cool. And again, just seeing the diversity present. So the next few sculptures I think of as my first attempts at new ideas of translation. I wanted to create sculptures that related more specifically to memories or experiences that I had had in the landscape and translated those into something a little bit more legible. And because of that, all of these sculptures kind of have little stories behind them, which I'll share as much as possible to try and give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And hopefully I don't go too far over time. So this piece is the Hutata conglomerate, which is one of the layers of Grand Canyon. And about a week into my river trip, we were floating on a day that we had to make about 18 to 20 miles on a completely flat water section. And it was a really windy day. I think we looked it up afterwards and we were getting headwind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. And we were just working so hard to move these 16-foot rafts through this flat water to get to our campsite. And we were rowing as hard as possible in 10-minute shifts. And then the next boatmate would take over and we just rotate in and out. And I was rowing and feeling very frustrated with this day that I thought was going to be pretty relaxed and easy. And I looked up and I saw this most spectacular cliff band of just dead level striations and these bright greens and rich blacks. And then on top of it, it looked like someone had smeared frosting, a conglomerate frosting on top of this cliff. And this relationship just felt so improbable, yet I was seeing it. And I thought, how can I be frustrated when this exists? How can I, feel, it just put everything into perspective of the significance of the moment in this grand scheme of hundreds of millions of years of geological history. So I really think of this sculpture as kind of a direct translation of that frosting conglomerate that I saw. And I'm using these same molds, 16-inch circles, to build this, but creating an armature behind it and creating much more volume. And this piece is about 5 feet across. So then this is the second part of that story. So this is the layered section of sedimentary rock that what forms the cliff beneath the frosting. And I had actually started this technique a little bit during my residency, but nothing significant had really come of it. But when I got back from my river trip, I cut up what I had and reassembled it, and I just knew exactly what I needed to do with these layers of paper. So this, I'm just taking paper that I've made and pigmented, ripping it into strips and very slowly gluing one layer on top of the other. So then if those two pieces are kind of more of a direct translation of something I've seen, this piece I consider a translation of something that I felt or experienced. And this story has two parts, and I'll tell one now and the other a little bit later. But this is not a true relationship of rock in Grand Canyon. This wouldn't happen, these two textures put together like this. So the interior is Tapete sandstone and the exterior is mauve limestone. And the mauve limestone is significant because where it meets its overlying layer, the red wall limestone, is where the majority of the fresh water springs come out of the walls of the Grand Canyon. So the groundwater seeps down through the fissures and cracks of all, thousands of feet above it. And then in the red wall, it forms these cave systems. And then the mauve is a little denser. And so it shoots out. And where these springs occur are just the most magical oases you could imagine amidst this desert landscape. And I wanted to create a piece that felt pregnant with the life force of the canyon. So I, created kind of this internal belly structure that was this sandstone that erodes in a very bodily, watery way. And I felt so much connection to the aliveness of the canyon through that water. So those last three pieces I made in the spring of last year. And then I spent the summer working towards a solo exhibition that I had at the Art Base in Basalt, which is a town halfway between Carbondale, where I live, and Aspen. And all of the themes are very similar, but I wanted to build upon that and create more installation-based works and try and get closer to building sort of an environment that the viewer could step into and kind of, submit to. So I'll just show a few install shots before I talk about individual pieces, but the show is titled Once a River, or was titled Once a River. And that title alludes to two things. One is the reverence that I feel for the Colorado River and all of its power in carving Grand Canyon and all of these canyons that I spend time in throughout my adventures in the American Southwest. And then the other part of it is a deep sadness for the fact that this river cannot be its full self because it's been dammed so many times along its course. And so, once a river is that it was once a river and now it's restrained. It was once a river and now it's a reservoir in certain places. But it's this sadness for what it could have been and these landscapes that could have been carved further. And it's also a sadness for what was lost, drowned under these reservoirs. So it kind of has this dual meaning. It's, this river is so powerful, but it's lost its ability to have significant seasonal fluctuation. And because of that, it's just totally transformed forever. So the show is kind of a combination of installation works and then more traditional wall sculptures. And this flower in the middle, this yucca, is a familiar centerpiece of life. We've seen that one before. So I'll just get into a few more little anecdotes in the last 15 minutes of my talk. This piece is kind of the start of a new body of work that I began in this show and I'm continuing right now. It's made up of all of these wooden arches that are finished with graphite to give them a metallic look. And the arch forms came out of another residency that I did last year. I had brought a bunch of scrap wood material with me, and I already had these pieces of maple that were bent laminated, but in thicker sections. And I started cutting them up and creating this structure that I knew I would want to make modular so that I could kind of play with. It was maybe more of a playful experiment. I didn't really know that it was going to get paper sewn onto it eventually. But as I was making it, and kind of during my residency at Grand Canyon the previous fall, I started to understand that my relationship to craft and to material in the studio really mimics my relationship to the landscape. So it's one of patience and gentleness, but also problem solving and decision making. And I tune into these micro moments of texture and color in the landscape in the same way that I tune into the details of my craft. And I wanted to marry the two, my hand with the landscape, into a piece that kind of spoke to that. But when I finished this piece, I kind of realized that it actually had this deeper meaning to me because it felt so like there was so much movement and dance in it. And I remembered on my very first night backpacking in the canyon alone, I had settled into my campsite at Tanner Beach and then walked a little ways up the side canyon. And I am a pretty reserved person. Like, I'm very aware of my body as I move through spaces, but something in that moment moved me to just dance. And I was in this canyon with only the walls of the canyon as witness, and I just let the energy of the place flow through me. And I, had never experienced anything like that before. So this piece became Canyon Dance. Then in a similar style of this piece is the portal. So you walk through it in order to enter the exhibition. I wanted to create a threshold, like I said, that you had to engage with to move through. And with this, I was working on some more fabrication problem solving, which I love. So I was 3D printing these joints that I used to attach the wooden arches together. And I was also thinking about, with this new edition of the 3D printed element, the furthering that idea of the land and the hand together. So I wanted to use the geology of today to try and envision the geology of the future. And I was thinking about structures like dams and how they restrict and restrain our environment so much. But maybe there's some utopia future out there where societal infrastructure supports and collaborates with the landscape rather than obstructing it. And I don't consider these sculptures to be, any practical problem solving or, solution to a dam or anything like it, but it's more of a thought experiment of what could exist in my head, in my utopia, if we could collaborate more with the landscape. This piece is, of course, of the same idea, but then I'm also gonna share one more little anecdote about where the texture comes from and why it's important to me. So Nankoweap Creek is where this mauve limestone texture comes from, where I took the 3D scan. And it's the same as in the water carrier. It's the same 3D scan that I'm using there. I walked into Nankoweap Creek 2 falls ago, I guess it was now. And it was also a solo trip. And as the crow flies, the trailhead is only about a mile from the South Rim where I was living, but to get there, it's on the North Rim and you have to drive all the way around the Grand Canyon. So it's about a 4-hour drive. And I got a little bit of a late start and I had some issues along the way. I tried to go to a different trailhead that would cut off a few miles of my trek, but it had rained the day before and it was a dirt road, and I encountered a section of about 18 inches of mud deep that I just couldn't get through. So then I turned around and lost a few hours, and I ended up probably starting out on this maybe 13-mile hike at like 2 p.m. And I was feeling really frustrated with myself for not having just made the decision to do the traditional route from the beginning. But I was in this really beautiful place and I was trying to kind of calm myself down on my 6 or 7 hour hike to be at peace with what had happened and accept that that was what the day had turned out to be. And now I was here and I could relax. And Nankoweap Creek is special because it is an historic trail into Grand Canyon. So it's been used by people and animals for centuries. And where the creek meets the river, there's a granary. So there's ruin of the people who are indigenous to the place. And so there, there's a lot of spiritual and emotional energy in this place. But I got to my campsite after dark and I went to bed a little anxious and frustrated with myself. But I woke up the next day feeling better. And as most of us know, waking up in a new place can just be so magical. And I took a long time meandering from my campsite, which was a few miles up the creek, towards the confluence. And as I walked through these canyon walls, which were the Moab limestone walls, I realized that I was walking through the wrinkles of a giant, the giant, that the walls of the canyon were the skin of something that was alive. And it just became so clear to me that the landscape was sentient when I had previously considered it inanimate. And this isn't a unique thought. A lot of cultures and religions practice this, but it was kind of my personal awakening, and I've never been able to turn that off ever since. I see the rock as a living thing, and I realized in this moment that the rock goes through these intense cycles of sedimentary deposition and then compression and then enclosure within other rock layers, and then eventual erosion to nothing over millions of years. And I thought, if that's not a life cycle, then what is? And it's really changed the way that I see the landscape, but also practice my artwork, because I try to imbue life into everything I make. And I hope that when the viewer encounters my sculptures, that they can experience a little bit of that. And then the final two pieces, or a few pieces that I'll show, are these 3 small suns, which were on an opposing wall to this red rock moon, which was a bigger sculpture. And as I was thinking about those millions of years cycles that the rock experiences, I was thinking about our own cycles as humans and how significant the cycle of 24 hours is. So I wanted to juxtapose that 24-hour cycle of sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset with the life cycles of the rock textures that I had incorporated into the sculptures. And I hope that people, when seeing that juxtaposition, can acknowledge that although 24 hours is a very significant timeline to us, we could have as much reverence for a time cycle of 1 billion years as we do for this, just because we aren't able to engage with it, something that length doesn't mean it's not important. And it's almost as if 24 hours is to us as we as humans are to the history of the planet. You know, I really think we might be gone one day, and that's okay because things change. Geology has shown us that landscapes have been taken so many different forms within the same location over time, and that's just the cycle of things. And now in my studio, I am working on a few new iterations of this. So it took me a while to kind of, after this show, get back into the studio and feel ready to make work again. It had been a pretty intense year of working. And I'm working on a few bodies of work that are totally inspired by this show and by everything that I had worked towards here. So on one hand, I'm doing some new layered pieces. On the other hand, I'm taking those pieces that I call the armature works with the arch forms. And if the ones in the this show that I've shown you are, you know, 4 feet per arch, I've now cast them out of bronze at about 6 inches. So I'm kind of working out of this maquette scale with those, because although I appreciated the impact of those larger works and their success in translating these landscapes, this vision that I have of the future, I think that they were really vivid fragments of what could be, but not necessarily complete thoughts. And I think of the maquette or the model as the first step in building any piece of significant infrastructure. And so hopefully by making these small maquettes, it will help us realize, or help me realize, that yes, one day my vision of the collaborative infrastructure landscape could actually become real. Thank you so much. If you want to follow along with my journey, I'm most active on Instagram. I do update my website every once in a while. But I appreciate you all tuning in and sharing this time with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. That was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions for Leah? This is amazing, and you're very articulate about how you started and how you arrived here. And I would just offer too, the artist statement really is so concise and clear, but hearing it from you is really following the journey.
Yes.
I love the moment, a 24-hour cycle versus this incredible environment that you're putting yourself into and allowing to come through. It's kind of like when people meditate, you know, you're that's there, you go on back to your life, but there is that incredible insight, and then layer the activism on it. It's just really profound for me.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate that. Saw one question in the chat. Thanks, Marianne, for asking, how did I learn geology? I would say that I'm really not much of a geologist. I mean, I know a bit, but when I was doing my Grand Canyon residency, I had a few books with me, and I kind of, you know, I memorized the layers. There are so many layers of rock in Grand Canyon. And then I would just try and learn a little bit about each one, how they formed, what they once were. For example, when I did that backpacking trip with the geologists, they were working in the hermit layer, and they were trying to figure out what did this landscape look like before it became solidified. And it's really cool because you can see they've kind of determined that it maybe was a bit of a marshy landscape which transitioned into being more arid, and then the layer above it is sand dunes. So there are these huge, you know, 100-foot tall crevices that were made by the hermit that were then filled in with sand, and you can see that recorded in the walls of the canyon. So I think just trying to connect with little moments like that helped me kind of solidify some of the knowledge, but I don't know a ton about a lot of places. I just know most about Grand Canyon.
Can I comment?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Leah, my name's Mona. I'm in Montreal, and I was at the carving studio about 13 years ago. So hello to Carol. I guess, yeah, I love that we've been transported into the Grand Canyon experience via your artwork. I am not courageous enough or able to physically go down into it, too scared. So I stayed at the top and was just wowed when I was in Arizona and that whole area. And you've really picked up on the colors. Like I really feel we visited it through your artwork. I'm struck by, and it's always like this, the world of sculpture, photographing is so difficult because sometimes I feel like I'm looking at something flat and then you say, oh, it's round, it's arched. So I was waiting for just to say your pictures are gorgeous, but I would like, where's the other side? Where's the, there's so many ways to do presentations. So it was just hard to get that three-dimensional full feel of what was seen, which means you're going to have to keep exhibiting this show so that I could come see it. Beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's challenging. It's so much better to see it in person. I always get jealous of painters who just need to take one photograph of their work, whereas I have to take like 50 in order to understand what's going on. But thanks, yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, the color comment is definitely that's good to hear because I'm trying very hard to kind of mimic the colors that I see there. And sometimes I'll pigment a piece of paper and be like, that looks like that would never exist as a rock. But really, I have seen these like bright azul blue stones in the canyon, and it's just wild what is possible through the geology.
I'm just wondering, Leah, how you pigment your paper. Like what's your process for doing that?
Yeah, I experimented a bit, but landed on these powdered pigments they're like natural, a lot of oxides. And I just mix it in with the pulp as I blend it or after I blend it. And so I should say that I'm like total DIY paper person. Like, I've only been doing it for a little over a year, but I think it's a great material to DIY because you can just make it your own. And I've done a lot of research into what like professionals are doing, and a lot of people use a retention agent, which would actually help increase the vibration of the colors, or the vibrancy rather. But then you would have to wear gloves while you're doing it because it's kind of toxic. And so I just use more pigment of this powdered stuff. I order from a supplier called Earth Pigments, and they just come in these little jars or pouches. So it's what I found works.
I just wanted to offer the what Mona was saying about the 3 dimensions when there was the sun and stone piece, and we're looking on it straight on, and then there was one image of it from the side, and it just made sense when you said it was enveloped by the steel, and just totally like punched it up for me just as a sculptural piece, and reminded me of Anish Kapoor, where you don't get that dimension unless you take the time to really see it. And yeah, that was really great.
Thank you. What an honor to be mentioned in the same sentence as Anish Kapoor.
Well, I think that was just that kind of perception is something I've always admired in art. And, you know, the other thing with the paper and the pigment, representing light, because you had this day cycle that you were working with. So it was clear for me to see which was which. And the transition was beautiful. It was, you know, what we feel, I think, when it happens.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what we live by, so it's familiar.
Yeah. Especially in the context of the recent eclipse, I mean.
Yeah.
It's it's really stunning to think about those other forces that are way beyond where we are.
Definitely. Let's see, my mom asks, you talked a few times about the idea of nesting, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. I'm not sure. I remember what I was referring to, maybe the smaller pieces. When I first started out. Is that what you mean? But I guess the idea of nesting, like incorporating pieces within pieces. So some of those original smaller circular works that I was doing had like one scan kind of inset or offset out of it. And I think that's what my idea of nesting would have been.
It also seems like the textures are harkening back to, like you said, the water, the escape, or the almost suction. That's what I felt. It was like it was pulling away the rock, almost like it had dissolved it. It kind of was nested among this, you know, these layers.
Yes, thank you for interpreting that. Absolutely. That piece definitely has nesting incorporated.
I'm curious. Oh, Mona, please go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, one is a practical one, and then the other is just my own association to a theme of work that I've done. But it just makes me think a little bit in relation to your work. And just some of the themes that I've done is a series. It's not my welded steel. It's when I'm playing with parchment paper prints of red, of all things. When you bake on parchment paper, you get a print, a beautiful print. Most people just throw the parchment paper away, but it looks very aged. And then I use that rustic kind of print, a natural print from the food, and then use that piece in some artwork. But the artwork has a lot, I call it beneath the surface. And they're kind of like archaeological digs, but profiles, hard to explain, but I'm just struck by the fact that I'm thinking of your artwork, and here you are deep down in the canyon, like in the bowels, you know, of this landscape, and just touched by the historical aspect. I'm just relating to it. I don't have, it's just my comments of, but it's a personal thing as well, right? Because you're digging into your interior, like your history, generations, familial generations, ancestors. It comes out. I just feel like that stuff is so old. I think it's bigger than us. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I think that that's what has been the best thing about experiencing this landscape, is realizing that everything is bigger than us. We're just this little blip in time. And I love having that perspective. I love being humbled by that experience.
And then just the practical question. Yeah, I agree. I'm not understanding where poplar is used in your pieces, because I know you have steel wire, and that just got I was trying to figure out technically what was going on.
Yeah. So the arch forms in those armature pieces our bent laminated poplar that I then finish with graphite and wax on top so that they look like metal.
Okay,
Yeah, but then that keeps them really lightweight, like those pieces only weigh a few pounds, which is really nice.
yeah. Good, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll say I also thought that they were steel upon first looking at them, and I was like, oh, what a beautiful curvature, like what incredible like metalworking. But then upon closer examination, it was clear. I'm curious what's next for you and how you get inspiration when you're not in the canyon. I imagine you're not there every single day, especially following the residency. And so
Yeah.
if you're thinking about experimenting with new materials or what another series will look like in the future, and just kind of how you ground yourself when you're not in that natural environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a place that I'll always continue to go back to, but I am surrounded by so many beautiful places nearby where I live. So kind of the next iteration of this work might just be textures from closer to home. I just was commissioned to make a outdoor sculpture for my town. So for that, I'll be collecting 3D scans from natural places near Carbondale and then casting them out of bronze so thin bronze instead of paper. And it will be kind of the same style as the pieces like the Portal or Nankoweap Creek, but freestanding, and instead of wood, I'll actually use metal to make those arches, and then I'll sew in the fragments of bronze together so that they kind of create a larger texture, but are a little more fragmented. But I have to say that I have been feeling disconnected from these places that have been so important to me because it's been a year since I've really spent significant time in outside backpacking or anything like that. And I hope that over the course of the next summer that I'll be able to get back into that emotional space a little more easily, and that will kind of spark some new ideas for me.
Thank you, and good
So-
luck with that. That sounds exciting.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
That's great. Well, thank you. Just love the work, and really thank you for breaking it breaking it down for us in such a clear and concise way and visually beautifully.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. And keep us posted. I think you got you know, a lively social media sites, so you can keep us posted on where you're going and how your work is evolving.
Definitely will do.
Great. Thank you all for coming, and we will resume this in person at the studio this summer, but the artist talk will come again in next winter. So thanks again, Leah, for joining us, and everyone else.